Good afternoon and most welcome to H892. And the title of the lecture of today is How Time Becomes Smaller When We Divide Time. How time becomes smaller as we divide time, and I think that in a way is completely self-explanatory. If you divide time in 3 parts by 2 divisions, isn't it obvious that time will in itself immediately become smaller? What is the cause of this division? Nothing is really happening in the exogenous external time. The division obviously makes only 1/3 of time available. The second variety, or the second take on the whole thing, is that in a sense, when we define what the now is, when we want to reach for the now, we do that by putting it into contrast to the absent and the future. And thereby, this limit will constantly change, and you can compare that to a mold of some sort. You know what a mold is? It's a form. Så att gjuta, to cast something. And for each time the mold is being used, it will cut something in a random way. So less and less will be left in the end. I think this metaphor is rather clear, and it actually shows the point in a very good way. So think about using a mold blindly again and again and again, and you cut out different parts of the whole thing. A little bit similar as you catch a crayfish, and I remember when you had to put the crayfish into a mold. That mold was used to measure the crayfish. It had to be more than, I don't even remember, it's ages ago. 8 centimeters, 10, something like that. I remember a friend of mine, he was rather clumsy, and he put the mold with all his force over the crayfish, and it lost its claws. This is what we're doing. The very principle of definition, or it's not a definition, it's not a verbal definition, but stancing out time in this way, molding it out, will diminish it. And I think this principle is a lot more easy to understand when it comes to space. But once it's understood, trained and done in space, we can transfer that knowledge also to time itself. And then hopefully we will not find it as difficult anymore. This is going to be a bit repetitious, and I think repetition is in place here because it will rather quickly become much more difficult. Couples Blakesley, Sarah and Matthew show that we are constructing constantly an interface, or rather, it should be said, an interface is constantly being constructed. It's a bit absurd to say that we construct it, so don't try to think in that manner, even if I'm going to say we for the sake of grammatical correctness. If that interface is being cut in a manner that is random, it will be as the mold, and things will automatically become smaller and smaller and smaller. And especially since the cut is random, it's the very randomness, as I mentioned before, that also Coppers Blakesley points out, and also hints from Ramachandran, Metzinger et al., who also pointed to that randomness of division. It needs to be a definite, sort of conscious, aware division, and made to suit the situation. That's the problem in a nutshell. If it's not to match the situation, we end up in problem. And the most problematic division, as we know, this is new evidence coming from neurology, is the very modern idea that our bodies end with our skin. That will become a mold. And since this is a new conception, it wasn't the case earlier on, because ignorance is a bliss. We haven't had this development within biology, medicine, anatomy earlier on. This could be compared to the development in anatomy when it comes to uncover bony structures in the body. The bony structures were a new thing, a discovery coming with, for instance, Leonardo da Vinci. But the first thing going in that direction was done during the Renaissance. After that, progressively we made the development in that area, and people started to think that the bones were some sort of aid to the body to make it stand. Possibly with comparison to how buildings are working. Start thinking about the bony structure as a system of struts. Something that can be deconstructed by mentioning, is that the case that human beings evolved as being bones, and then later on received flesh, muscle, sinews, skin, so forth? Of course not. That wouldn't work. Bony structure cannot be understood as taken apart from the rest of the body, and as well the bony structure is not an essence, an archaea of the body, but almost everyone in Western society, I would say even everyone, think about the bony structure as the building element in the body. And that's the reason why this misunderstanding of how the bones have an effect. If you were not thinking of the bones as being the thing that you move inside of the body, you would not have misconceptions. People who are unaware of these ideas of the bones as being essence or an archaea of the body do not misuse themselves in this manner. And I think it becomes so obvious where the body map interferes with what's really happening. Just to think about bones will start the procedure. The couple Connable fixed this by having a correct body map of the bones. But it could also possibly be fixed by getting rid of the bony idea completely. But that's not easily done. Cannot unthink a concept. That is absolutely impossible. What you need to do is to soften it up and you see how things come into balance. As you see, biology, medicine have given the idea that our bodies ends by the skin. It's a common conception. And I think it's very important, especially in Western society, even more so in Swedish society. This has influenced how we move about. It used to be the case in the 18th century, all people were very touchy. When I say touchy, they were constantly touching each other, walking around hand in hand, talking and touching at the same time. Swedish people have never been intimate, but there was constant touching still going on in the 18th century. The reason, I think, is because we did not perceive the skin as belonging to the other person. Thereby touching that person, it did not interfere with his intimacy or integrity. Whereas this tendency furthered, we stopped touching each other when we talk, when we discussed. This is very obvious from the songs of, for instance, Carl Michael Bellman, where you really get the conception people were sitting tight together, touching each other, and that was the natural way of going about, even though you were reserved still. Did not touch personal stuff like ideas, belongings, and so forth. By putting a distance between each other, we further this belief that the skin is the domain of yourself, and you make that domain fixed. It's a fixed division, that's the problem. It's not so much it goes in the wrong way, it's the fixation. And all of a sudden you start identify yourself with the mirror image. It gets constructed, or you construct the body map, the interface, for a good reason, to use it in the interaction. In combination with the endogenous and the exogenous, inner, outer. That's where it does its purpose. If the interface is locked, it will be like a stupid computer interface that cannot be changed and doesn't serve the purpose of helping the computer user to understand, possibly throw things away. Like the garbage can in a PC would have a dual purpose of both saving and getting rid of things because of a stupid division in the interface. This is the same. It is maybe not stupidity, unknowingness, not knowing is the cause, and the effect is this fixity in space, and you completely narrow down, which can be visible even from the outside. We look and feel much more narrow than we did 200-300 years ago. Not touching each other is not the only reason why this has happened, but I would say that it is it doesn't help, it makes it worse. Once you get fixated with this idea, you start, instead of having movable interface. The division moves according to situation. This fixity becomes the point of identification, and all of a sudden you have a loop directly, not leaving the inner, going directly back and being self-confirming, and you start saying, this is my body, which is very odd. I think I mentioned earlier on that maybe 300-400 episode. Western concept of body is incredibly different from the Eastern, for instance, which is not homogeneous, but the Western you don't find anywhere else. This idea of a complete lockedness to the skin, it's also a very new concept. So instead of using the interface, you go around identifying yourself with your own skin, and you're saying to yourself, this is the limit of my interface. We know that is not the limit, but the idea that it is the limit will hinder your movement, your functioning. It will drag down your energy. It will make you hurt yourself when you do exercise. This is one of the reasons we have repetitive strain injury, because these divisions become fixed. And that fixation is a fixation in the body as well. Just give me a second, I need some. You make this limitation, and this limitation becomes the mirror image, which you start to identify with. A little bit like the evil queen who looks into the mirror. And this self-identification is disastrous for the body image. Becomes fixed. I can mention just in a happenstance, looking into the mirror is also something really adding to the problem when it comes to anorexia. For every time they look into the mirror, they establish the idea that they are what they see in the mirror. And since what they see in the mirror is circular, so to speak, is a perceptual circulation, you might remember 3 times more neurons goes to the eyes than from the eyes. So what you put into the mirror is what you're going to get back. That means that every time you look into the mirror, you will enhance the problem with your self-conception. You will self-identify even more. There are even doctors today who hasn't read the latest in neurology. I think it could be a good idea to let an anorectic person look into the mirror. It is definitely not. And part and parcel of the mirror image problem is, I'd say 99% of the population in Western culture think that the thing that coming back from the mirror is actually an accurate thing, and comes part and parcel with the idea that we have an external world, and that for some mad reason will be visible in the mirror. There is no truth to the mirror image in that way. It's not identical to yourself. But the belief it is identical to yourself, belief not shared by, for instance, Indian people, that belief will start the whole thing with self-identity. And when you self-identify, you usually lock out the idea of you expanding into space, and you narrow down. You literally become smaller, hunched, you lack energy, you want to lie down rather than sit, or sit rather than stand up, which is very, very uncommon in India, incredibly uncommon. You usually don't see people other than standing or sitting in a comfortable way. When they lie down, it's because they want to sleep or have a rest, not collapsing into the sofa, which is painful. But we get used to this pain, and you can imagine the pain of being hunched. It is tremendous. But slowly we get used to our own terrible prisons. Opening up to space again makes that we widen directly. So one could say there is a cure for this, and it's instant. But training the skill, it would take time, because you get better and better at it. But it could be very helpful to understand it always gets better. It doesn't get worse. For every time you think of it, you will actually train it. But it is, I can agree, a complicated thing, because everything we do is because of this fixation of an external world, something that starts in the external world. Westerners don't know much about their inside. But just think it without questioning too much. Don't ask what it is, just think it, and you will see it will be more and more enhanced. We need also to take in the space to be localized. We need to be somewhere in space. Our bodies need the information from the sitting bones or the heels or the soles of our feet. And when we are using the origo, we take away that valuable information for our system. We are no longer localized, and we ignore space that can learn us how to orient ourselves. So we know where we are, we know where our head is, we know where our legs are, we know how to move without being discoordinate, unbalanced, undirected, or not direct, could be the true way of putting it. And this is a suppressing, because we start defining ourselves in contradistinction to what we are not. And what are we not? We're not the surrounding space, we start to think. That becomes the negative. And there is a blockage going on. There's a very good parallel here going on with Betty Edwards. She showed that most drawings made by people today are inaccurate. When they draw a human being, it is chunky, it's circular, it's too squarey, it's too cuboid. And the reason for that is that we are blocking out space. When we start to block out space is usually when this process of learning how to see reality has stopped. It usually stops at somewhere in the age 8 to 11 years old. And all of a sudden we see, when we paint a face when we are 30, 40, 50, 60, whatever, it will be the same face that we draw when we were 8, 9, 10. Whatever that age was, when you stopped accessing space, coming into space. And that means that you stop learning space. Space is not that incredibly stupendous simplification of the XYZ. It is vastly complicated, and you need to put your head and your skill to learn it. This is something you stopped doing when you were that age. Another thing that Betty Everett showed was when we depicted, for instance, a chair. It's the most famous example. We will not put the legs of the chair in good order. We confuse what is further away with what is closer, and we make the shapes all wrong. Most people will say this is not necessary, this only has to do with drawing. It has not, because we can draw anything. If you can write, you can also draw. You have enough skill. It is actually meaning this is how you perceive the world. And the reason for you perceive the world is you don't have enough knowledge about how the world is constructed. Betty Edwards claims that can be helped by drawing. I seriously doubt that now. I'll come to another conclusion. It will help only after you open up space and starting to make those divisions a little bit softer, lenient, more flexible, and start changing the division in your interface. Still, it could help to have drawn, but the drawing skill will improve dramatically once you get this opening up function into the system. If you stop when you paint or draw to go into yourself and shut space off, it will be much more amenable to development. You will gain space for each time you draw something, whereas you sort of go into yourself, you narrow the space around you, you will lose your energy a little bit, and you will literally sort of move towards the thing you draw. Put your nose closer to the paper and your eyes will become more strained, whereas they relax when I take in space around me. You get this more softer vision, and it's of course it's nice to have an eye contact with this softer vision, but it needs for you to take in space around you and train that persistently, because it will get better and better as you train. Since you stop when we're 8, 9 doesn't mean that it's not repairable. You can regain the knowledge you should have had and get even more. I think it's funny, the idea that most people of today say and claim that they see depth in reality, whereas all neurological proof shows that they don't see depth, because you need to train depth, and it's a constant training without any end. Space is not at all that simple as we imagine, and the very conception, the gestalt of space, it's a no knowing most days now, I would say. The method of Betty Edwards can be directly applied to your own body as well. Therefore, it could be helpful to train some of her exercises. The most common thing is to take in the negative space, the non-essential space, the thing that is not the RK. You see, taking in what's around you will open up and make you more present, will make your interface more functionable, more balanced, more agile, more energized, and all that. You take away that lack of energy and you start feeding it energy instead. And as you learn more about space, you will become less disengaged in space. You will not be as disoriented as you used to be. Most Westerners are horribly disoriented. They move in a ways that's really odd when you look at plotted people. Plotted people with some sort of device that makes a plotting on a movie, and you will see that they move about like this, whereas walking straight and in an effective manner is more the way of people how learn how space works. That also goes for a good sportsman. They don't do any extra moves. It would be too uneconomical, and it will also hinder their career. Put a little break here. Most clearly also Betty Edwards calls this symbol thinking, or symbol perceiving. Symbol, symbol, symbol. Using symbols instead of real things is using something that is self-identical. And self-identical is this more negative way of self-identity. It doesn't go into the exogenous, doesn't go to the outside. This is a projection coming from yourself, which never lands in something outside. I usually call this outsidedness instead of using the more difficult and problematic word reality. It's very interesting, the problems how you use your words. But just mentioning reality gives symbol association with me, at least. I don't know how it is with you who are listening, but for me it gives directly an idea of symbolism or symbols. And this also helps to give this very persistent idea of an outside reality. And when you speak about an outside reality, it is the self-reflecting tendency, the loop, and the self-confirming functioning. So outsidedness I will use henceforth until I find a better word. Outsideness has the quality of difference in Derrida's wording. Doesn't have the quality of properties in the usual way, because properties are always almost symbols. The properties won't help you to make a correct drawing of reality. Difference will. And that is actually very interesting, because most helpful books in how to learn drawing cannot do much help to you. This is something I experience, and also my colleagues when we started to draw. It's very nice to buy a book to help you with the drawing, one thinks, but they won't help you much. It's not the same as buying a book in how to fish or how to build a house. The book in drawing doesn't actually help you, because what you need to do when you learn to draw is to unlearn things that you think about the reality, and that is quite different, and that makes the task of learning to draw much more of an inner and outer adventure. And this is also one of the reasons drawing, calligraphy can be so incredibly improving of one's skills once you letting loose a little bit of this very, very distinct and unhelpful divisions, these contradictions. One could say that the All-Gestalt gives us ontic things, and these ontic things are the symbols you draw. Drawing just symbols is very common. They oddly enough look very similar, and I would say that is not because of a similarity in the world. It is that certain traits in our inner are similar. There is a similarity. I don't think there's anything wrong to say that, but the similarity is more from the inside than from the outside. We should always partake in the outside, and outside is difference rather than anything else. And it's a fixation also almost to the word mentioned by Betty Edwards, not really, but she calls it symbols. You can also call it substance, essence, and presency, the now fixation, because the strain of drawing something takes time, whereas our normal perception of reality shouldn't take any time at all, should be timeless, should be in an instant, in a now, directly. And it is a relief to take in the space when you make a drawing and use the negative space. Draw that instead. You will also understand better that you are constructing a negative space around you, and that negative space needs to be in the picture. Emptiness comes in, and emptiness is the absolute prerequisite for existence. Getting rid of emptiness is also getting rid of emptiness. I think I mentioned that some time before. It's not only Sarah and Matthew Blakesley that have shown that the division in the interface is something that needs to be very flexible, movable, and adaptive to what the signals the outside world makes. This would be equivalent of what rhythm time has in the exogenous part, the ones outside ourselves. The difference, what sort of difference is going on in the world, this is what we need to be intending to, or directed to. So we need to be directed to the differences. So we need to have rather, and this is a matter of scale, but a rather unbiased body posture to be able to react in a proper way. More of an openness to what situation could develop, not fixed position like this. Open and poised, I would say. They show that posture comes back once you take in space, and it also is greatly helped by our tendency to, when you learn how the proper bone structure works, a little bit of that imagery of how the bones are sitting inside the body disappears, I noticed. Very odd. One should think that they become more prevalent, but it's actually just the opposite. They disappear from vision because they start to work. And it's a little bit when the body is in balance, it's not as noticeable as in being heavy, ungainly, not doing the things you want to. Lack of coordination makes a heavy body feel. That I can say. It's a body feel that is heavy, not joyous, not easy, not shining, not directed, and so forth. I really like all those adjectives that really do some good help to understand how it works.